So it's going to be my great pleasure to introduce Betty Ann. And I know Betty Ann from, she was not only my teacher, but my mentor, my instructor for 2 years as I went through biblical counseling certification. So I know this beautiful, godly woman has a heart for God. She chases after Him. And I know that she also loves to walk in His creation, and not just walk in His creation, but she loves to just observe and marvel at that creation. And the one story that has always struck me that she would talk about is snowflake. Oh, and that's always remained with me on how each snowflake is individual. She just marvels at a snowflake. So I just always love the fact that she can look at creation to just that little bit of that snowflake, and she sees God in it. And so that's just a beautiful thing that always really sat in my heart about Betty Ann. And so it's my privilege to be able to introduce you to her. So Betty Ann served the local church in discipleship roles that include speaking, teaching, mentoring, counseling, and training biblical counselors like me. Fueled by her passion to see the Canadian church convinced and equipped to care for souls through the living word, both incarnate and inspired. She does a great job at that. God has led her to inspire and encourage so many hearts. Betty Ann serves on the board of the Biblical Counseling Coalition and has worked together with a team of like-minded men and women to launch the Canadian Biblical Counseling Coalition. But I think the closest to Betty Ann's heart are her roles in being a mom to Laura and Joshua and his wife Jenny, and of course to being a grandma to Emma and Ethan, which I know that's probably a closest part, but she does a really great job in bringing biblical counseling to Canada, and thank you. I'm so grateful for that, and I know that you guys are all going to enjoy this next hour as she encourages us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here and see some familiar faces. You, some from decades, a long time ago, and then some new faces. How many of you were here last night? Were you all here last night? Mostly. Last night they laid a really good foundation of sort of a theological foundation for living out of the image of God. This is going to be a practical conversation about that. If you remember last night, Matthew spoke about presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice to God. And that's what I'm talking about. What does that look like? So we're going to be thinking about nurturing or stewarding our mental well-being by thinking about how we care for our soul and our body, and then stewarding our stories as well. So this is actually a self-care conversation, and I wonder if self-care is something you believe to be right. Because sometimes Christians have the idea that we're not supposed to. Sometimes we believe that godly people give until they drop. Had anybody in here? That's like, I think that's why God put Paul in prison. Before you drop, I'm going to stop you for a little while. Kevin was in my class when I taught it here, 19. No more banter, you. Maybe we think that somehow it's more sanctified to live as if we don't have any needs. I think that's something that we can tend to think. I hope if that's you, that we're going to begin to undo that idea as we have this conversation. So I want to think, we're going to try to make this a little bit interactive, and because we've got the camera on, I'll try to remember to repeat. Help me remember if I forget. What skews our perspective on what's appropriate in expending ourselves or caring for ourselves? What kinds of things affect the way we think about that?
Probably what others expect.
Yeah, definitely others' expectations would be one. Yeah. Other things?
Other Christians, how they don't do it right, and you think because they're up there and they're leaders, I have to be like that.
Yeah, so if somebody else is overworking and they're sort of like some kind of a role model of some kind, then you think, well, I should do that too. Yeah, yeah.
Our interpretation of Bible verses, like do everything wholeheartedly, do everything.
Right. The way we interpret scripture, we're going to start with that right next because this is really important. Sometimes it's a stage of life. Have you been in stages of life where you're like, there's just no stopping here, right? But that can't go on forever. Sometimes it's even like cultural influences, and I would say, how many of you have traveled outside of Southern Ontario and like sort of really got the chance to feel like different culture? Yeah, because I'm realizing now that we in Southern Ontario live in a way that's not entirely unique in the world, but somewhat unique in the world, and it's not healthy. And it's just what we know, so we just do it. So this skews our perspective of what's right. Well, everybody else is going at 90, so why wouldn't I? Or maybe I should, and I feel guilty if I don't. So sometimes it's what we say to ourselves too. But there are things that skew it, and I'm hoping that we're going to have a conversation today that will help straighten it out a little bit. So we're going to start by reasoning together from God's Word. You have a page on your table that looks like this. And this is why I was trying to get you all at 5 tables. Because if you look at number 2, it's got 5 sets of verses. So we're going to lay a theological foundation for this conversation too. So I'm going to ask this table to take the Exodus and Ephesians passage. This table to take the Matthew and Colossians passage. This table to take 1 Kings and Proverbs. And then you guys take Matthew and Proverbs. And then the table at the back take 1 Corinthians and Proverbs. See where I'm at? Everybody understand that? And here's the thing, because we're tight for time, I'm giving you like 2 minutes. So get in there and see what you see and think about what they speak to you about stewarding your life for God's glory.
If Phonetic song, Jesus, a stage shall be all.
Let your loveliness very familiar past it. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon me, journey for me for a champion. This comes down to God, Jesus. For me, yep. Be my boy.
So covered, especially like I heard you guys last night. Just sorry, email the days. Yeah. You did not would you something you priest. It means birthday. You're not your me, but you were bought. Girls. That's that. So.
Say, class, cassette, yeah. Just. Where's it?
I'm just trying to think. We need the context.
Perks. Was it just doing?
Was all folding out the sounds. So, yeah, follow. Also, let Brasso top back. The bell and Benos. Not all out for your life. Yeah, the previous long you line here when you arrive. Now to be a slugger, but soon there is still.
Okay. I think that's all the time we have. I hope you had enough time to talk about it. All right. We do want to have, here's the thing about it. This thing that we're trying to do is figure out how to live life in God's world. So the best way to do that is to listen to Him. So I want to lay that foundation just for a few minutes before we start. So you guys had, you have Exodus 20, 8 to 11. Want to tell us what that passage is about?
Work for 6 days and rest on the Sabbath.
Okay, and then Ephesians 5:16,
The most of your time.
which is your verse you quoted, right, already? I think you mentioned that verse in your previous comment. I don't know, was it that one? Working wholeheartedly. Oh, that's the Colossians one. It's coming up. So what do you see there? Table 1. Any thoughts?
Complete rest on one day because God rested on that day.
Yeah. And then he told us to, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So here's what I want us to think about. There are practical implications of that we may all handle differently, but I think we can assume at least one, or maybe it's a few actually, like sort of assumptions we can take from that. One of them is that we're not like God and we need rest. God didn't rest because he needed rest, but we need rest. So we're made in his image. That's what we're talking about this weekend. But one of the ways we're not like him is that we are not without limits. And he designed the limits, and then he's telling us, live within the limits because you're limited. So that's that. And then making the best use of the time, because the days are evil, is one of the verses I think that we tend to use to make ourselves press on. Okay, so you guys, what have you got? What did you notice from what you looked at? So you looked at Matthew 11, 28, 30, which is Jesus inviting us into a rest. His yoke is easy and his burden is light. And then your other one was the verse that was mentioned earlier, whatever you do, work heartily as to the Lord.
One observation I made is that rest comes from Jesus. It's not about self-care. It's about Jesus caring for us.
Yeah. So rest comes from Jesus. It's not about self-care. It's about Jesus caring for us. Yeah. And he cares for us. One of the ways he cares for us is by wisdom and leaning in and living in his wisdom. So that's one of the things we're aiming for. The rest that Jesus is inviting us into is definitely the rest that comes from entering into relationship with him. But I do believe there's another piece in that living in that rest on a daily basis as well, not just that entering in. Okay, so table 2, table number 3. You guys have 1 Kings 19, 4-7. What did you find there? This is a really precious passage to me.
It's the famous one where Elijah is depressed and at the end of himself, and God tells him to rest and see.
Yeah. So this is Elijah. You use the word depressed. You know what I think we could potentially use for this time in Elijah's life is burned out. It really, like, he's pulled. He's just like pushed, full on. There's been a big spiritual victory, and he is at the end of himself now. And so desperately so that he's saying, I just want to die. And does God reprimand him? Does God tell him, get up and get going? What does God do? He provides for him. He lets him sleep. And when he wakes up, there's food and drink for him twice. And then out of God's provision, he goes on a big, long journey with God. There's a space. Like, you think about the space in Elijah's life when for 40 days he's walking and he's not having to minister and do work in that 40 days. God was doing something in those 40 days differently. Okay, and your Proverbs verse was?
A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest.
And
poverty will come upon you like a robber and go out like an armed man.
yeah, so poverty grows out of a little bit of sleep, a little bit of rest, a little bit of folding of the hands to do nothing. So I hope what are you noticing? I intentionally set these verses up to create some tension. You notice that? Yeah. Because the Bible presents us with that tension. And one of the things that we need to understand is it takes a whole Bible to make a whole Christian. We don't go with one verse and run with that. That's not going to help us live healthy. If you live with make the most of every moment because the days are evil, and you think that means I have to just do, you will very likely end up in that place that Elijah ended up. And that's not because there's something wrong with you, except for that you have not interpreted God well. Okay, so Matthew 15:32 and Proverbs 20:13. That's you guys. Who's your spokesperson?
Okay, so the Matthew verse was about GB, and he's talking to the crowds, saying he's noticing the crowds are weary. He's going to provide some food for them and take care of that need. Yeah. And then the Proverbs one was, don't love sleep because it'll lead to poverty. If you open your eyes, that you'll have food. So if you're working, you'll have food. If you're sleeping.
Yeah. So on the one hand, one of the things I love about this verse and the First Kings verse is that it's very clear that Jesus, Jesus, sees our physical needs too, right? This isn't just, so this is a crowd of people who've been fed spiritually for 3 days. And he's saying to them, but they're hungry. They need food. Because he sees that in us. He knows that's a real thing. Maybe they brought food with them and they've run out of it now. But these are real needs that he put in us, that it's right for us to consider how we care for them in wisdom. Okay, and then the other one was, that sleep letting you come to poverty. So that same tension. And it's so important that we see this in Scripture. Okay, so the last group on your corner. Who's our spokesperson back there? Nobody. They have 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20. I'll read it while you're thinking. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Okay? And then your other verse was?
Keep your heart with all the joys, from it flow the springs of life.
Yeah, so this is Proverbs 4:23. Keep your heart with all vigilance or diligence, depending on what translation you had. For from it flows the springs of life. So from these two, we're seeing God chooses to make his home in us. And he wants us to understand that by being chosen by him means that our bodies aren't ours anymore. They belong to him. That we exist to bring him honor or glory. That's why we're here. And here's a truth that might surprise you. God is not most glorified in us when we are amazing. He is most glorified in us when our weakness and our frailties become a platform for his grandeur. I know this for certain. Do you know this for certain? Can you point to scripture somewhere that tells you that's exactly true? Because I want you to know it not from me, but from him. 1 Corinthians 12, or 2 Corinthians 12, 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul has a thorn in his flesh, and he asks the Lord to take it away. It's interfering with my ministry. And God's saying, no, it's not actually. That thorn serves a really good purpose, to keep you from being elated. Satan has a purpose too. It's meant to discourage him. But God's purpose is to keep him from being too proud of himself and to humble him. And then he says to him, out of that weakness, my strength will be seen and I will be glorified. That's the goal. And then that Proverbs 4:23 verse is a little bit different because it's talking about our responsibility to steward our souls. And he's saying to us, this is so important that because all of life is flowing out of what's going on inside of here. So this really matters, that we're thinking carefully about how we care for the inner person. So my thesis for us this morning is this: our best potential to live as healthy emotional beings to the glory of God will grow out of faithful stewardship of our bodies, our souls, and our stories. This is what I mean when I say self-care. It's not about you, it's about God's beauty being displayed. So I want to ask you another question. If we were to have a conversation about physical health, what kinds of factors would we consider in that conversation?
Food, exercise.
Food, exercise, sleep. The sleep finger is sleep, rest, and recreation. Those are all important parts of a healthy life. So sleep, or food, exercise, recreation. What else might we consider? For some,
Health or disease.
yeah, for some people it might mean some medications, things. It should mean regular checkups of some kind with a health professional. Those are the kinds of things we talk about. Why do we talk about those things when we're talking about our physical well-being?
There's a direct connection.
Yeah, because we know that when we think about those things, it's going to impact our physical health. Have you ever noticed that when we have conversations about mental health, they're not the same? Sometimes we talk about mental health as if what we get is what we get, and we can't do anything about it. So I have anxiety, it just has the last word in my life. And I want you to think about a reality in that that's not actually true. There are things we can do about our mental health, just like there are things we can do about our physical health. So I have another question for you. Do we all have the same potential in our physical well-being? This is an easy question.
No.
No, we absolutely don't. Because we're different. And God has done different things in our bodies that impact. Does that mean that if you say you're one of the people who has diabetes or you have a cancer diagnosis or something, you just go, oh, well, no, right? You still have a responsibility and a privilege to steward the body that you're living in, regardless of what has come at it or what's happened to it. I broke my arm a couple summers ago, and I did all the things I was supposed to do and nothing helped. And I thought, well, I guess I'm just going to live with that limitation for the rest of my life. And then I found an osteopath. And the osteopath is like a magician. You need somebody. and my arm moves now. So by God's grace and his kindness to me, I got my arm back, which was really lovely. That doesn't always happen. But it was my responsibility to pursue health as best I could for that right arm. And so I did. So this is also true of our mental health. We're all given things that have happened in our life, factors that are beyond our control, that will have powerful outcomes in our mental well-being. Some of those would be things like childhood trauma, or things that like I don't know about you, but the war in Ukraine has really rocked my world. They're at like 1,180 days or something of this onslaught of attack. You can imagine that living there right now is really impacting mental well-being, right? We get to go to sleep at night and assume that we're going to sleep for the night, and if we wake up, it's just going to be because our bodies woke up, not because there's going to be a air raid siren going off and we're going to be running for the subway again. So that kind of stuff, there are things that are happening come at us that we have no control over. But even with those, we don't just go, oh, well, what can I do to steward my mental well-being? So here's something I want you to hear. God's not expecting us to arrive at the same place in either our physical well-being or our mental well-being. He's simply asking that we steward what we've been given, our bodies, our souls, and our stories for his glory. And I'm going to get to that in a minute, the story part in a minute. So if you look at this handout with the number line, this number line is bothering you, stick with me for a minute, because I hope you'll feel better about it after I have talked about it. So on the right-hand end of the number line, I have what I believe to be a reasonable working definition of good mental health. This is still, there's room for development. If you have any suggestions, just let me know. So this is what I would say. Often experiences thoughts, emotions, and or desires fitting to the circumstances of life with the ability to self-regulate. And by self-regulate, I mean having the ability to promote peace, joy, and hope in God by means of a grace and truth-fueled inner conversation. So we have conversations inside our head all the time, and sometimes when our world is rocked, those conversations are important. On the left-hand end of the number line, I have working definition of a poor mental health. Often experiencing thoughts, emotions, and or desires inconsolably or uncontrollably. Can you envision that? Maybe you know it. This definition immediately brings to mind a time when I was traveling in a remote part of Western China. I knew that I was 3 hours away from the nearest foreigner, besides the one I was traveling with. And that was leaving me feeling somewhat vulnerable. If I didn't have her, nobody around me would be able to talk to me, and I would not be able to talk to them. It wasn't a place where anybody had English. And we were driving in her vehicle on a winding mountainous road with rock walls on one side and sheer drop-offs on the other side, and there were no guardrails. And we came to this place on the road where they were doing some road construction. And up here on the rock wall was an excavator that was knocking off boulders the size of cars onto the road to widen the lane, I'm assuming. But this meant there was only one way at a time traffic. So we had to sit there under that excavator. And most of you don't know my story, but I'm a widow because of an excavation that went wrong. And I could see here that the safety handbook was not being followed. There were no rules in operation in this situation. And I'm going to tell you, sheer panic set in. I thought of my kids here at home who'd already lost a dad, and how long it would be from the middle of nowhere, China, for word to get back to them to tell them what had happened to me if I were to die in this place. In those moments, I plummeted to the lower end of that number line. And then I remembered God, who sees me in the middle of nowhere, who reigns supreme in every situation for his glory and for our good, who loves deeply and could care for me in that moment and for my kids, were my darkest predictions of that moment to come to fruition. Peace descended. Fear wasn't gone, but peace was bigger. In those brief moments, by the power of the Holy Spirit and the weaponry of our warfare, I was clawing my way back to the other end of that continuum. Life in a broken world is going to present us with an endless cycle of moments like this. And I think it's good for us to understand just how fluid our mental well-being is. It isn't stuck someplace on that number line. There's potential for it to move, and sometimes shockingly without warning, and then sometimes methodically, systematically, as we fight our way to bring God into a painful situation. Most of us know we don't live in one place on the number line, that our mental well-being is fluid and vulnerable to things like think of the things, like maybe a rude comment from a kid. One of your own kids says something rude to you. That affects your mental well-being. Maybe it's a spouse who's speaking unkindly. Maybe it's a string of rainy days. Or maybe it's an excavator perched dangerously above you on the edge of a cliff. I wonder if the truth that we will never be able to arrive at that hand end of the number line and just stay there feels frustrating to you. It's my hope, rather than a frustration, that it's a relief. If our mental well-being is this fluid, we can have hope that we don't have to be stuck in a particular place on the number line. I think that's why the number line's helpful. I also want to draw your attention to the inclusion of hope in God in my description of how we regulate ourselves. No one outside the Christian community, obviously, is going to add this phrase to their definition of good mental health, but I think we must. We live in a world, God tells us in Romans 11:36, that is from him and through him and to him. And if that's true, we believe it is because he says that, then it would be deeply delusional to find hope in anything else besides him. So that's what we're aiming for, is to build a life of hope in who he is and what he's doing in this world. As we try to consider mental health from all sides, mental well-being, before we get to the stewarding part, I want us to consider where Jesus landed on the number line. Any thoughts? Where would you put him on the number line?
Well, what point in his life?
At every point. He was perfect, so all of his expressions of emotions have to also have been perfect, right? He was perfectly well in every way. So his mental wellness was perfect, which means he's a terrific example for us. And I want to say, as we look at the examples, it's not that we're aspiring to be like him exactly, because we aren't him. But we are drawing from him, and he is our example to consider what it might look like. So here are a few of my, and I want you to think of this like, sometimes I have file folders in my brain. Do you do that? And so I put stuff in there, and maybe 6 months from now, I'm adding something new to that file folder. This is one of those file folders. Jesus, what does it look like to be mentally healthy from the life of Jesus? So I'm going to give you a few, and I hope when you read your Bible, particularly in obviously the Gospels, you will find more of these. So one of them that I looked at was Luke 4. In Luke 4 is when Jesus is being tempted by the devil. And Luke 4 says that he was tempted for 40 days. Sometimes we think he was tempted after the 40 days, but Luke 4 says he was tempted for the whole 40 days. The culmination are the ones that we know about. The devil wanted him to worship him. He wanted him to tempt God, jump off and see if he'll save you. And then the devil wanted to give him authority. And I don't know about you, do you face temptations? Do they kind of rock you a little bit? Jesus is steady. He's unwavering. He roots his hope and his confidence in God's words, and he is not shaken by this temptation. That, to me, is perfect mental wellness. Matthew 12. This is a time when the Pharisees are after him because his men have been picking heads of grain on the Sabbath day. So when I'm in a conflict situation, it's usually 3 days later that I figure out what I should have said. Mm-hmm. Do you do that? And I love that in his perfect mental wellness, he was so clear-minded that not only could he give an answer to the Pharisees, he could also use it as a teaching moment to help them understand who he really is, not these ideas that they had about him. So that's another example. Another place where I feel like I had a good look at his mental wellness is in the book of Mark. You can listen to the whole book of Mark in about 1 hour and 10 minutes. It's a good thing to do sometimes. And when you do, you start to see patterns. And one of the patterns we see in Mark is that Jesus would go someplace and he would start healing. That got people's attention so that he could teach them. But eventually the healing becomes a distraction. It's like a circus. And he says, okay, we're moving on. Because no matter what was coming at him, he remembered his main goal. And his goal was to teach the truth, to speak the truth, not the healings. So think about that. Do you go to bed sometimes at night and think, there's 20 things I should have done today I didn't get done? I feel like that's part of our lives. And Jesus could leave people behind unhealed because he knew what he was really about. And he didn't get sidetracked by the other things that would pull on his heart. And you think it wasn't that he didn't care. It wasn't that he cared more about the people who did get healed. He knew he'd done what he was meant to do, and he needed to go where he could teach again. So that, to me, is really good mental well-being. And let's see. Luke 9:51 says this: when the days drew near for him to be taken off, he set his face toward Jerusalem. And this is a quote from the Old Testament somewhere, and it says he set his face like flint. Is that familiar to anybody? Yeah, and I feel like just that resolve to face the hard thing even though he knows it's going to be really hard. And that is mental fortitude. This is a level we're never going to be asked of, I think. And yet he went because he knew it was what he was supposed to do. He walked in obedience even when it was really hard. And then my last one, well, no, it's not the last one, second last one. And then this one I spent a lot of time thinking about. Have you ever wondered about, you know when at the Last Supper and Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me? And they're all going, like, who's it going to be? Is it going to be me? If you had a group of friends and you knew one of them was going to betray you to death for 3 years, like you knew this, do you think your other friends would kind of know you had a thing about them? Yeah, I think my friends would know. What is your problem with him? Well, it's the future. But I love that these 12 men walked with Jesus in this intimacy and they had no clue that Judas was going to be the one who would betray him. He loved them all with the same love no matter what. To me, that's extraordinary mental wellness. So just in case this is piling on a whole lot of pressure and painting one picture, I have one other verse I want us to look at. And this is Hebrews 5, verse 7. And it says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers with loud crying and tears to the one who was able to save him. It goes on to say in verse 8, he was heard because of his reverence, which means that we can pray with loud crying and tears, and it can be reverent, and it can be perfect mental wellness. Because sometimes that's what's fitting for life, if you go back to my definitions on the number line. Sometimes our lives are like that. And in this broken world, if we're not moved to tears fairly regularly, there's probably something wrong with us. The world is hurting. People are hurting. And we should hurt with God in that hurt, like Jesus did when he wept over Jerusalem. I meant to draw you to me like a mother hen with her wing. And I want that for you, and yet you wander from me. And that wandering is where our pain came from. So I think that it's important for us to understand that this is a full range of what it might look like to live as a human being with mental wellness. How do we steward this? How do we steward our bodies and our souls and our stories so that, like Jesus, God's glory is on display? I want us to think about a few factors that are going to impact. So one of the things is that we do have things that we have no power over that come at us. So we looked at some a little earlier. Some of those are negative, right? So things like loss. I mean, Jesus had authority and power over what was going to happen in Jerusalem, but in submission to God, he did it. So he knew this is really hard, it's going to be hard, and he's crying. My friend is going to betray me, and I will be cruelly killed. I will suffer deeply as a physical being. And so he wept. So some of the circumstances that influence our mental well-being that come at us would be like loss of all kinds. That can be betrayal or abuse or neglect or death. Some will be positive, like godly parents, healthy extended family relationships, growing up in a country with freedom like we have in Canada. I think about that, and I think about what a blessing it is if you live in Canada, and this has been your home always, but if you're Ukrainian and you ended up here because you had to flee your country, even being in Canada isn't that great, right? Like if I'm from Ukraine, I don't want to live in Canada. I want to live in my country in peace. But I'm sure they're grateful there's some place where their lives are safe, but that's going to be affecting their mental well-being to even live in our country that we think is so great. Cultural norms affect our mental well-being, that busy thing that we do in Southern Ontario that I talked about at the beginning. It has an impact on us. And if we don't know that, we're in trouble. We need to be paying attention to how that busy is affecting us inside. Global events have anybody's mental well-being affected by the recent election? That's all. I don't want any answers, right? But, right? Like it affects us. Those things affect us. And it might move us somewhere on the number line, but it's fluid. And we do get to do something about that. So it doesn't have to hold us, or it doesn't have to take us somewhere even worse. So there are these, and the other things too, there are things that happen to our body that affect our mental well-being. Brain injury is one of those things. We understand that the thyroid function can have a really significant impact on where we are mentally. So just knowing those things are there is an important thing. Understanding our environment, our bodies, is helpful for us if we're going to think about how do I steward myself for God's glory. Here's something I think is really important though. These things are all influential. These are important words, but they're not determinative. So they have an influence on how we're feeling and how well we're doing in a mental wellness way, but they don't control it. So pay attention, and then we're going to talk about what we can do. Here are some of the things that we can do. These are the choices we can make to help us with our mental wellness. So you know what? Sleep and rest are important for physical health. They are also important for our mental wellness as well. Did you know that? We have the idea that more is better. More work, more fun even. We ask a lot of our bodies. When we're tired, this is going to hurt a little bit, we use things like caffeine or sugar to override what our bodies are telling us. Am I right? Yeah. What we need to do is pay attention to what our bodies are saying. Has it ever occurred to you that sometimes making the best use of your time might be sleeping or resting? Our bodies have been designed by God in such a way as to require a chemical reset that happens each night as we sleep. I'm confident that sleep can be a faith-fueled expression of God's instruction to humble ourselves under His mighty hand. He's the one who made us this way. And when we go to bed, even though there's still 20 things we didn't get done in the day, and take that 8 hours sleep, we're saying, God is fully capable of running His world without me for the next 8 hours. He can take care of things. He doesn't need me. This is wisdom from Scripture, and I think that that's really God-glorifying, to be able to let ourselves go to sleep, even though we know there's so much left undone. So let me encourage you to listen to your Father and to your body, and don't accept the idea that you can override your physiological needs. I think diet and exercise are complicated for I'm in a different generation than some of you, but for the generations from me and on, in a way it wasn't for our parents or grandparents. And the reason is that our lives have become very sedentary. Most of us work at a job that doesn't require us to move. My mom grew up on a farm. Life was busy. You moved, and that was healthy. So we have to figure out how we live the way God made our bodies to. Our bodies were made to move. They weren't made to sit still. So if we sit still, there will be physical ramifications, and there are actually mental or emotional ramifications as well. I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. But you do need to know your body and respect the needs that your body has. We have easy access to so many foods in this time that are not good for us. So this eating well requires a kind of discipline that also wasn't required of our parents. Moving and eating is different for us. part of the problem with that is that we don't learn. Like I learned eating habits from my mom, where everything was just made in our house. You know, there was nothing that, I mean, we ate canned vegetables, which was terrible. Canned peas are the worst. Does anybody even eat canned peas anymore? Are they even in the store? You eat canned peas? By choice, Ian. Wow.
Weird, eh?
Yeah.
That's like other vegetables.
Oh man, yeah, but otherwise it was made by her, so food was fresh, and now it's the convenient foods that help us be busy are not as good for us as foods that are whole foods. So these are areas that we have to work harder at in this time, in this day and time. We have to think about it. Do you know what endorphins are? Do you know the like street name for endorphins? Endorphins is something God did in your body, a chemical that he put in your body. The name that people, like sort of the street name, in this, the happy hormone. Endorphins are released when we move. So God made us to move, and he said, when you move, not only is it going to help your body, it's going to help your state of mind. You will look at life more positively because you moved. That's the way we move on the number line. We move ourselves by just going for a walk. And as Kitty told you, like God's creation for me is like a direct line to seeing him. And I follow a guy on social media who takes pictures of snowflakes. I think you probably saw some of them, didn't you, Kitty, in the class? And sometimes I just put one of those pictures on my computer screen and just go, wow, God. Like, that is so incredible. You need to look at a picture of a snowflake and see the intricacy of the design, that goes all the way into the middle. Every snowflake has 6 points, right? 6 points. Yeah, and in the middle there's this little hexagon thing. What's the 6-point thing? Anyways, it's so incredible. And that's one snowflake, and I live with a park in my backyard, and I'm like, how many billions of snowflakes are out there, God? And you see every one of them, and every one of them uniquely designed, and you love them. And then they melt, and they're gone. That to me is like so enlivening. This is moving me on the number line. So sleep, diet, and exercise are important pieces of how you steward your physical well-being and your emotional well-being. I'm not saying make yourself a super athlete. I'm not saying you go crazy about, organic food or something. I say, what's one step you could take that would improve how you care for, how you steward your body and your soul and your story? So these things are not ultimate, but they do play a part in our mental well-being. It's wisdom for us to acknowledge them. And I would say, at the very least, they can help remove obstacles in our mental wellness and our physical wellness. However, there is one thing that's ultimate, and that is our intimacy with God. So this goes back to the Proverbs 4:23, guarding our hearts with all diligence. Circumstances of life and care for our bodies are significant factors in our mental well-being, but intimacy with God has the power to override every hardship and shortcoming we will ever experience in this life. When I think that thought, I always think of Johnny Erickson Tada, who can't move any part of her body. So she can't do endorphins. And I don't know how she eats. Maybe she can eat pretty normally, but she doesn't sleep. We know that if you're paying attention to her. She has to be turned every night, all the time, so she doesn't get bed sores. And she's in pain all the time. Who knows what I'm talking about? If you don't know who I'm talking about, you should find out. Because she's inspiring. She loves Jesus. She's been in a wheelchair since she was 17, and she's now in her, I'd say, late 70s. Which is remarkable. Nobody even lives that long. She runs an organization with a staff of 150 people. But here's how she fights. She fights with this, with guarding her heart with all diligence, knowing that from it flow the springs of life. I'd like to suggest to you, and this is kind of an unusual, might even feel a bit radical suggestion, that each of the things that we've been talking about are spiritual disciplines. To submit ourselves to God's design for our bodies is a spiritual discipline. Because gluttony is a thing. I was thinking about gluttony this week, and you know what? Gluttony isn't only about food. We can be gluttonous about many things. We can be gluttonous about entertainment. They can be gluttonous about things that numb us, like scrolling on our devices. So this discipline of stewarding our lives, I think is a spiritual discipline. And I have a quote for you from a book. This book, I really commend this book to you, Habits of Grace. Some of you know it, yeah. It's a spiritual disciplines book, but I think it's the most accessible spiritual disciplines book there is. And he keeps it really simple. And well, I'll read you the quote first. It is in this endless sea of God's grace that we walk the path of the Christian life and take steps of grace-empowered effort and initiative. So all the things I've been talking about is not a fleshly effort. This is grace-powered effort. Here's his metaphor. I can flip a switch, but I don't provide the electricity. I can turn on a faucet, but I don't make the water flow. And so it is for the Christian with the ongoing grace of God. His grace is essential for our spiritual lives. We don't control the supply. We can't make the favor of God flow. It is flowing freely. But he has given us circuits to connect and pipes to open expectantly. There are paths along which he has promised his favor, and we can routinely avail ourselves of these revealed paths of blessing or neglect them to our detriment. These spiritual disciplines or means of grace serve as if we've put our mouth under the tap on a hot summer day. That tap is flowing, but if we don't get our mouth under there, we're not getting it. Growing intimacy with God will always lead to growing mental wellness. Not immediately and not without some faltering along the way, but mental wellness is a promised outcome of this relationship. And maybe you're wondering where it's promised. We're going to finish with this. Psalm 19, verses 7 to 10, I'm going to read them to you. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, more to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey and the drippings of the honeycomb. So because of the nature of Hebrew poetry, which this is, we understand each of these statements to be parallel with each other. So each of the nouns, law, testimony, precept, commandment, and even fear of the Lord, are synonyms. God, through the psalmist, is telling us that his perfect, sure, right, pure, clean, and true words are life-giving. When our souls need to be revived, go to his words. When we need wisdom, go to his words. When our joy is waning, go to his words. When we need light for the way, go to his words. When we do, we'll find those very words to have greater value than much fine gold, sweeter than honey from the comb. In God's words, we grow to know how deeply loved by him we are. And this is our ultimate means of nurturing elemental well-being. If you remember back to that moment in Western China that I spoke of, it was truth gleaned from his words that had the power to bring you back from the brink of a full-on panic attack. This is how he works peace in our souls. He reveals himself to us, and knowing him gives us strength that we would not have otherwise. I want to leave you with these words from Paul in the book of Romans. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope. And we actually maybe have like 4 minutes if anybody has a question. Any questions? In your library here, do you have some of the 31-day devotionals in your library? I'm assuming you have a library. Yeah. I was thinking about resources, that this is something that you need to think about. Tim Challies wrote a book a few years ago called Do More Better. It's a little book. And he's not talking about doing more, but he's talking about doing more of what you're doing better. And that might mean getting rid of some of the things you're doing. And there's, in the 31-day devotionals, there's one on rest, which I think is just a really helpful thing. We need to think about rest more than the average person in all of history, because we don't rest well in Southern Ontario, 21st century. And we're not living out of the rest that God's given us. There's a lot of, I think there's a book called, The Anxious Generation. There's just a lot of anxiety in our day. And part of it's just we don't take time to renew ourselves in the Lord. Thanks for coming. Okay.